folks. Back again. So, show of hands, how many people were here the last hour? How many people weren't here the last hour? Oh, a few people. You wouldn't have missed that much, though. So great. That's good. We'll be able to just pick up where we left off. So here's that agenda we've been working. This is where your slides go sideways, because we're going to flip down to validation. I gave this talk last week and found that it was just easier to finish up the details about the controls first and then come back to the very sort of deep and difficult topic of data binding. So we're going to do that. Otherwise, the slides are the same. So, input validation is really, really interesting in the ASP Plus framework. So typically, we actually analyzed a bunch of pages online that did input validation, and typically they had lots and lots of script in them to make it work. Because what you want to have happen is you want to have the user interact with the page and have them know as they go along when they've made an incorrect input, so they can correct it without having to burn a trip to your server and probably a trip to your server's database to find out they did something wrong. And so that's the whole point of input validation. And we said, is there a way that we can do this that will reduce the amount of scripting that people need to do in the client, in the browser, to make it go? And the answer is, yeah, we did a great job. So our current input validation framework for many, many common types of validation requires 0 client script that you, the developer, have to write. Instead, the validation controls themselves emit the right kind of client script, and it executes on those clients who can accommodate it. So that's the goal. It's not exactly true in the bits you got today. The bits you got today, right now, we drew the line very arbitrarily at IE4 and better. So if you have IE4, IE5, IE55, the up-level client validation works. Otherwise, you get validation on the server. So a couple of things. Your inputs are always validated on the server. That's intentional on our part. We wanted to make sure that you didn't set up validation and then were unprotected from users who might spoof you by getting around your client-side validation and going straight into your server logic. So there's a symmetric validation that happens on both client and server, but optionally on the client for the up-level browsers, and only if you have it enabled, or more accurately, if you haven't disabled it. So here's an example. Validation is largely, it can be, you can use code, but it's largely, in most cases, totally declarative. In other words, I just add a tag in, and I can add this after I've designed my form, and I put the tag where I think I want the error message to appear. And it's pretty simple. The real goo here, I have a text box in this example, and I have a required field validator, and the middle line there, control to validate equal text box 1, that's the glue. It's just done declaratively, so when we initialize the page and all the controls, we wire it up for you. And that's it. In this particular case, I also have a text property. That's the error text that will show in place wherever I put this validator in my page. So here's a list of the supported controls. Required, range, compare, regular expression validator, that's kind of cool. Custom validator allows you to write your own server-side and or client-side functions for validation, and then a summary that can allow you to consolidate the error messages all in one place. So let's go back to my sample machine here and look at a few examples. So I had a complaint about the size of the font. Do I need to bump this up for anybody? No? Yeah? Let's just go a little bigger. How about 19? How's that? Better? Okay, so here's that same example I had before where I have a text box, text ID equal 1, required field validator, control to validate is text box 1. The error message I'm going to show if it's not filled in is required field. And then I have a couple of properties that are going to control how this thing displays in the page. First of all, I've said I'd like it to be static. This is useful in HTML because a lot of HTML is rendered flow-based. you know, it's really relying on something to be taking up that space. And if it's not, you know, and you take the control away, you don't render it even as a blank control, it might change the way your layout looks. So by saying static, I can ensure that the space is used up. Likewise, width is just like width on other elements in HTML. It tells me how much width that thing should take up. The alternative is to say dynamic, in which case we won't even, there'll be no HTML rendered when the error message is not present. And then I have a password field. It's another text box. In this case, the text mode is password. Guess what? You get little stars when you type in it. And it's a required field validator, and the control to validate in this case is text box 2. Let's go ahead and have a look at this guy. And it's in intro 2. So just to give you a really quick idea of what's going on, I hadn't done any input yet, and I just clicked the round trip, and it said, hey, required field, required field. If I start to make input, I'm not very particular about what the input is, but as soon as I tab off that field or change selection with the mouse off that field, let me get it back to the way it was. So either way, I can tab or I can change selection, basically lose focus from this text field. It'll go ahead and validate again on the client. Right, so it's done the client-side validation. And that's all I had to do, is just put those validation tags into my declarative control. And just to be really clear, this particular page has no script block in it. So here's an example of something that's using server-side logic. They do need to be we do require that both of those text boxes and the required field validators say run at server, but I'm not using my own logic against it. It's just baked into the framework. So that's pretty easy, especially, you know, it's incredibly easy in Visual Studio to just drag and drop these things. Really good stuff. So that's a pretty simple one. Oh, come back. So the next thing I want to talk about is this little property right here. The state of validation for all of the controls in the page is tracked by the page in a property called isValid. And only when all of the validators are in a valid state does that property get set to true. And this is an opportunity for you to further customize how your page behaves based on the state of the validation controls. So in this particular case, I'm going to throw a message on round trip when I click the validate button that says page is valid once all the validators are valid. Otherwise, it's going to say, hey, some of the required fields need to be filled in, blah, blah, blah. The rest of this page is just as we saw before. Text 1, text 2, with a couple of required field validators. Let's have a look. So fill in the fields below. Dot, 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 dot. So this guy is only getting updated on round trip by filling in the fields. I haven't cleared the message, but as soon as I click the round trip, I'm going to handle that valid event and do something special about it. So you can totally think of other circumstances that you might only do some action, show UI to the user or whatever, when they hit that valid state. Perhaps they're still posting back to that same page. Let's take a look at the next example. So the first thing I want to show here is that I'm forcing the page to render down level. What that means is down level equals older browsers, not necessarily supporting JavaScript, for example. And by saying down level, it's going to always post back to the server to check the validation. I won't get the client-side experience. And in this case, I have a validation summary control. And I've set a couple of properties on it. The text that it shows when there's any error is you must enter a value in the following fields, colon. And then I have these 4 properties just influence how the thing displays. my same two text boxes again. And I've added in each case an error message, password and name. This error message property actually is the one that bubbles up to the summary, the validation summary. So I can show them error messages both in place using the text property or in the validation summary using error message, or both. Let's go have a look at that one. Validator 3. So that's what the validation summary looks like. And I don't have validation turned on the client. But when I press validate again, it goes post back, runs the validation, and updates. So let's go back to slides for a minute. Bloop, bloop, bloop. So there's the page is valid we talked about. Before we go to targeting up-level clients, I thought there was one more slide. I want to go back and show you just one or two more examples of validation so you get a sense of the range of possibilities that the validation controls support. Let's have a look at this fourth one, validator 4, because it's a bit more complex. Oops. Pilot error. Here we go. So this is a compare validator. There's actually several samples for each of these validation types inside the quick start that I mentioned in the last session. Oh, sorry. Can you go back to slides, please? Or a demo machine, please? Sorry, guys. Okay, so this compare validator takes two strings or two of some type of value. It'll also work with things like date, time values, currency values, etc., integers, and a comparison operator. And you can compare between two input fields or between an input field and a static value. Range validators work in much the same way, but it's pretty simple stuff. Does DDD not equal to EE? Not, it's valid. It's not equal. Equal? Not valid. If we look at the code, again, I'm targeting down-level clients. And I'm getting that message for valid and not valid by handling is valid. And I'm also forcing a validate when I change the list selection, my operator selection. But very simply, my text box 1 is called text COMP. The second one was text COMP2, compare to. And here's my compare validator here. Control to validate, control to compare, and type. So you can see that this validation framework is really pretty simple to take advantage of. And we got both client validation, or we can force server-side validation with very, very little effort whatsoever. It's pretty nifty stuff. One other thing you should know is that it's possible for you guys to create controls that expose a value, an input value in particular, that can participate inside of this framework. It's also possible to create controls that are validators themselves and will validate input from other controls. The two creating controls talks that I have listed at the end of this presentation go into some depth about that, and I think they actually have an example of creating one of these validatable controls. That's validation. Okay, back to slides. So we already saw one way that you can target. Oh, hang on. Back to slides. Here we go. We already saw one way that you can target an up-level client versus a down-level client. This switch is pretty big and chunky right now. In the bits that you got today, right now it just says IE4, everybody else. So not wildly useful, but it's a start. And in our framework, that same thing that you saw just a minute ago, a page directive at the very top of the page that says client target equal. Auto is the default value. It'll automatically try and figure out whether you're IE4 or better or somebody else and do the right thing, in particular mostly for the validation controls. You can force it to be to work down level, which says really only do server-side processing, don't do anything that requires sending JavaScript down to the client. Or you can do force up level and say, hey, I know that the guy is going to come in with a different browser than IE, but it's going to work anyway. Make it go. So those are the choices that you have. So there's in the beta 1 time frame, IE4 and later, validation controls only. In addition, we still support the notion of perusing the browser caps. So if you in your page logic or in your pagelet logic or in your control logic for custom controls want to do something more granular, this is still here. We have this request.browser. And a whole bunch of attributes that you can test and do things conditionally inside of your own logic. Something that has changed is that browser caps now are inside of the .NET Framework's config.web file. So there's a whole set of entries for browser caps there. It's an XML style entry. It's not a lot more sophisticated than the old browsercaps.ini was, though. It's pretty much about the same level. Okay, so that's the last of the control stuff. Now we're going to get into the really meaty stuff of data binding. Data binding in web forms is different than you might have experienced in VB, for example, in the past. We really mean something quite specific when we say data binding in web forms, and we use the word data binding mainly because it's the most convenient word to use, not because it maps the most closely to your past experience. So what do we mean by data binding? It's a simple way to get data and bind it to web UI. In the case of web forms, what we do is we actually take a snapshot of the data and bind to the snapshot. And we can bind to lots and lots of different kinds of things. We can bind to properties on the page or fields on the page, properties of other controls. You can bind to data objects like data sets and data views. You can bind to arrays. You can bind to lots and lots of stuff. You can even bind to the output of a method. I can say, go get my property, go get categories, have a get categories function against the database and bind to the result. Very flexible in the way we do the data binding. But it's a one-way model. We allow you to take the snapshot, but we don't do anything particularly special to help you get the data back out if a user has changed it. I'll show you some examples of how that actually works, but it's not automatic. We're relying on programmers like yourself to decide how you want to handle it and do it the way you most prefer. So here's some examples. I want to start with something really simple. Actually, before I go to this, I'll show you some examples of those few things I just talked about, binding to a property, binding to a field, and so forth. And then we're going to show an example of binding to a simple list. These are lists like listbox, drop-down list, and so forth. And the steps that you would take to data bind in a list would be declare the list in your page. Optionally, set a couple of properties. These map to the text that's displayed in the list and the value that gets bound into the list, the value that's returned when you make a selection in the list. Then you set the data source property of the list and call data bind on it. Let's go ahead and try this with a few examples, and hopefully you'll get the sense of what's going on here. So going back to the demo machine, here's a super simple example. I have a page here with a public field on it, string S. And I make an assignment of S in my page load method. and then I say page.databind. And here I have my data binding syntax in the page, S. So this looks familiar. I showed this at the beginning of the last session. I said there's a new kind of thing you can put into your page. It's angle bracket %pound equals, or pound, and then your expression or your field or your method, and then close %pound. This looks a lot like angle bracket %equals, but it actually works really differently. So I want to be really crystal clear about the difference between these two things, because it's a place to get really stuck if you don't understand the difference. So in angle bracket %equals, that code gets executed only when the page renders. And to review something we talked about last session, the way that an ASP Plus page executes is very different from the way an ASP page executes. An ASP page executes by rendering. Everything that happens in an ASP page, the classic kind, happens at render time. So it just marches across the page and executes the code as it finds it. And if it finds code in a render block, it executes it at render time. In ASP Plus, the page is compiled. When it executes according to an event-driven model. So page load will first the page will initialize. Any properties that are set declaratively will be set on all the controls inside the page. All the logic and page load will run. In this example, that's when we'll data bind. Other event handlers will run. Then the page will render. Any code that's in the render blocks will execute at that point. And then we'll page unload and dispose of those objects. So what happens here with this data binding expression in yellow over here is that it gets executed when the code calls data bind. That's when it happens. So in this case, I've called data bind on the page. This binding expression is just in the page. It's not bound to any control, so that's an easy way to do it. So it happened essentially, we got the data and made the assignment at the point that page load was running, not at render time, much in advance of that. So it has a big effect on how what the resulting page looks like. It's very important to know not only, well, two things. You must call page.databind if you want your data binding to succeed, to happen. And it doesn't happen at render time. It happens well in advance of that. Let's see a couple more examples. Here's a slightly more extensive example. I have a couple of properties on my page. I have one that's called customer ID and another one that's order count, and they're extremely simplistic. Hope you don't mind. And again, I'm just binding them straight into the page. Here's my customer ID, my order count. Oops. And I'm calling just page.databind in the page load method. So let's find this guy. That's to prop. So not wildly compelling, but that's what's happening. Another example. Come back. Close a couple of these. In this case, I'm going to bind to an array. And in fact, it's an object called an array list. It's a type in the common language runtime. So I just create a new array list and I add a bunch of values to it. I set my data source of a drop-down list to those values, and I call data bind on the drop-down list. So for control, I call the control name.databind. So there's an abstraction here that's worth understanding. Data bind cascades. So page will cascade data binding on all of the controls within it that have a data bind method. And that method just cascades. So by calling page.databind, that's the heavy hammer. You hit them all at once. But you can have granular control and data bind the controls individually, as I've done here. So let's run this guy. I have a little button handler here that picks the value out of the list, or the text item from the list. But my declaration for the list itself is pretty simple. Here's the drop-down list. Run at server. Nothing special happening in the declarative code, but at runtime, bind to array, you can see I get data binding pretty easily here. And I happen to have a little event handler on that particular example. One more, and then we'll go to a more extensive list example. In this case, this one binds to a method. I have a function here called even or odd. And based on a parameter that's passed into this method, I'll return a string that says odd or even, just as a little test on the guy. And to run this thing, I have a drop-down list that has a set of values. And that's one kind of data binding. But what I really want to show you here is this method that I'm binding to here. This is a data list. Inside of it, for each of the items inside of the data list, I'm going to repeat this data binding. It's binding to this even or odd method, depending on the data that's bound in. Let's go ahead and give this a whirl. Intro to method. So these are items 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and they're alternatively even, odd, even, odd. So that value is data bound, so is that one. So I can bind to lots and lots of different things. But for the rest of the talk, I'm going to show you binding to data because that's what people usually do, real data. So let's go back to the list example that I originally promised you here. So before I can really do much with this list example, we have to explain what's going on here with this code. And I think I actually have a slide. I'd like to go back to slides for just a minute and talk to the data source example of the slide that I have, and then we can really rock and roll on the data binding. It's a lot of goo, I know. It's a lot of code, but it's pretty standard ADO plus creating a SQL connection, a SQL dataset command, setting the connection, setting the command, creating a new data set, and filling the data set from the command. And then finally, we're going to return down here where it says get sample data equal. That's the VB version of return, the default view of that data we got back. So at the end of the day, when we run this guy, we're going to get a cursor on a select query against the titles table in pubs. That's what we're getting out of this. We're going to see this same query over and over again over the next little bit, so I wanted to show it to you in some detail before we go forward. So here it is. Here's that same function, get sample data. It's going to return a data view. And here it is. It's returning a default view of my titles query. A couple important things to note. I had to import a couple namespaces to use these, use the SQL types inside of my page. So I've done that. And then when I go to data bind, I'm data binding to the result of a function. In this case, it's the result of that get sample data function. I'm going to bind the data view to the data source of my list. And then I call list.databind to make it happen. One more thing to note is that I'm using the if not pages postback test to conditionally execute this logic only the first time I load the page. As I post back, it's going to restore the values in the list from the data it has cached in view state. Let's make a little space here. And here's my list. It happens to be a radio button list in this case. Its name is my list. I've set the data text field as well as the data value field. These are field names from my data item, my data row, the row coming back from the data source. that I want to bind into the value and text properties of my data list, or my radio button list, and then run at server. So let's go have a look at this guy. Actually, let's make sure which one I'm looking at. List demo 1. So there it is. It's a bound list. And I happen to have a little event handler on the button that says, you know, you selected, and then grabs the selected text out of the list. Okay? And I'm posting back numerous times, but we've only loaded that data once. We take a look at the source. You're going to see there's a fair bit of view state here. That's where the data is going in between round trips. Can't show properties. But the rest of what's in here is just straight up HTML with the data, with the values already bound into it. Okay, I hope that makes sense. Let's go back to slides for a minute. So this is just what we just saw. We saw setting the data source on the list. That's the property we have to get data pointed at. Doing the data bind function to make it actually happen. And then declaratively, we'd earlier set which fields we wanted to have bound into the text and the value properties of this list. So this method works exactly the same for not only this one, but drop-down list, ASP list box, ASP checkbox list, and HTML select. HTML select in our server control model uses exactly the same data binding methodology. So if you're doing HTML and run at servering HTML, you'll use this same method. So let's go a step more complicated. Data grid. It's actually in some ways not more complicated because it can be as simple as simply setting a data source on data grid and calling data bind. But the steps are declare your data grid, optionally declare its columns collection, set a data source, call data bind. Let's go ahead and do it. Okay, so this looks familiar now, I hope. Our imports and our get sample data function. This will look familiar too, except now it's my data grid instead of my list. Otherwise, it's the same. And here's my data grid declaration. ASP : data grid, ID. I set a couple of properties here, or one property, just to make it look a little nicer. The naked data grid is really naked. So I set a background color for the header. Run at server, and that's it. Let's go back and have a quick look. So there's the bound data grid. Same data, except it's now binding. So data grid has a couple of things about it that are worth knowing. One of them is that by default, it'll just bind or create a column for every column in your row source. So in this case, I've got columns that have names like title_ID. Not totally attractive for a real application, but that's what it's doing. And the property on data grid that controls that is called auto-generate columns. So implicitly it's on, and that's what's just happened. It's auto-generated a set of columns for us, matching the shape of my data source. Let's go back to slides for just a minute. Here's the one we just saw, binding to a data grid. Now we're going to do an example where we set the auto-generate columns property to false explicitly, and then also explicitly declare the columns that we do want to have included. And we do this by using this special property called columns. This defines for us a columns collection, and we can declaratively say which columns we want. Now, there are many different types of columns in the data grid. There are about a half a dozen different types of columns in the data grid. I'm only going to show you a couple in this next example, but then we're going to make another side trip over to the Quick Start because there's a lot of good information there, and I want you to just be aware of where to find good examples of different kinds of grids, grid layouts. So let's take a look at this one. We have a columns collection, and the first one we declare is a button column. And it's not even bound to the data. It simply has a command of select. The next thing we declare is a bound column where we actually get to set the header text instead of using whatever text came out of the database, and explicitly set the property on that column, the header property on that column to have a particular text. And then we do that again for a different field in the data source. So we'll do that in real life over here. This part looks just exactly the same. But down here, we have that columns collection that we just described. Part number, that's not very, I guess it's fine, as a descriptive title and title. When we run this, you see we get something that's a little more useful than the last one we looked at. A couple more properties I'll introduce you to on data grid. There's my auto-generate columns. In this case, I've set cell spacing to 0. This will take, for IE at least, will take the gap out of between the grid lines, right? Because we're just rendering, at the end of the day, in an HTML table. So for those of you who are familiar with tables, this is a nice way to make the cell spacing look pretty good. And I increase the cell padding and run at server. So slowly building you up on more properties on data grid. There are many that control the rendering of data grid. Oops. I have one more data grid sample that I want to show you. Again, the data itself looks just the same. This is the difference. Remember I made that select button? I want to handle selection in this grid, and there's a grid is more abstract than many of the controls, and it does have an idea of which element in the grid is currently selected. It also has this idea of being able to set styles abstractly, which render as a regular HTML when the thing goes down to a particular browser. And in this case, I'm saying let's set the style of the background color to be yellow. The rest of this page will look just the same. So we'll go back and grab that guy. Well, so I don't have the same style sheet on it. But just by doing that, because I have a command button there with the command select, there's some baked-in logic inside of the grid that says, hey, if I see the command select, I'm going to make that particular row be the selected one. So we have very similar logic for add, delete, edit. There's some other functionality inside of the data grid. There's more you have to do to handle those events because you're going to need to supply the logic that goes and touches the database. But there is some wiring inside of the database to handle some, or inside of data grid to handle some of this. Let's go back to Quick Start for just a minute and go to the controls reference and go to data grid. There are 13 or so samples in this list that go into quite a lot of detail about the different kinds of columns you can bind to in data grid and how they work, including things like the edit command column that expose for you in sort of an easy way edit buttons on any particular row in the grid, and examples on how to use each one of these in both C# and VB. Okay, back to slides. I guess they can see me back here. Okay. Data binding with templates. Templates is another huge, big innovation in the ASP Plus framework, and they're a little tough to explain. It's almost one of those things you have to show somebody to get them to really grok what a template is about. What it does is it permits us to sort of separate the behavior of a bound list from the way it looks and feels in the final page. Now, I say a bound list because that's the only controls that we supply that support templates, but they're not really limited to bound lists. That's just the spot that we have them right now. Templates are simply a property on the control that give us additional information about how the item within that control should be rendered. In fact, most of the controls that have templates for us have more than one template. Just to give you an example, data list has a header template, a footer template, an item template, an alternating item template, a selected item template, and so forth. So depending on what, in the case of selection, it might actually change and show more information about an item and leave the unselected items collapsed. So there's a lot of powerful things that you can do with templates. But what they do is they give you the ability to control the look of the list rather than relying on us to create a control that by flipping a whole bunch of switches and getting them just right will look the way you want it to look. So that's what templates are, lookless UI. And so they allow you to customize all kinds of stuff, not just style, but structure as well. You can put controls inside of a template. So I've showed you some columns that have buttons. Well, I can have templated items that have pictures and other kinds of controls, pagelets inside, lots and lots of different things. We're going to show how to build controls that have templates in them in the Building Server Controls Talks 1 and 2. So if you have an interest in learning how to actually create a control that does this, you'll get an opportunity to actually see real source code, understand a little bit better about how it works. So steps to binding a templated list, though. So in our case, all the templated controls are bound lists. And so we need to know more about data binding because it's a little more complicated with a templated control. Setting the data source is the same, so you declare your data list, you set its source. What gets a little different is you actually have to declare the templates themselves and declaratively define the data binding within them. That's the big different step. And then you call data bind. So let's go over here and do an example. See if I can switch over to code. So this one's actually slightly different than this example here. I have a repeater. So we have these three controls that are templated lists: repeater, data list, and data grid. You've seen data grid without using templates yet. It's possible to use templates for individual columns within a data grid even. Data list has a lot of structure to it. Anybody here in my first session today, this morning, where we made so a few of you were, it's actually, maybe I should run through that one more time, where you actually can take HTML structure, stick it in a data list, but will further put table structure around each of the items in the list. So if you're really trying to rubber stamp a little snippet of HTML and have it repeated for you according to the properties of this bigger thing, this data list, that's a great way to go. The third option is repeater, and it assumes no structure. And this allows you to have the most granular control over the HTML that's emitted. In this case, I've used a repeater. So I have a repeater here called myList, and the data binding of this looks exactly like we've been seeing all along, just setting a data source, calling data bind. But I have three templates in this example. The first one is a header template, and all I do in the header template is say, begin my table. It's going to emit this little piece of HTML. Next, I have an item template, the contents of this template is going to be repeated for each of the items in my data source. So if my query returns 12 records, I'm going to get 12 of these. And each one of them will be bound to a different record or a different row in the data source. And then finally, I have a footer template that closes my table tag. Drilling into the item template, we start a table row and end a table row, and then we have 4 cells, 2, 3, 4. And then we have some magical data binding syntax here that's worth explaining. So inside of a templated list, we have an abstraction that allows you to get to the actual row that will be bound one row at a time to the items. So item template doesn't know about all the rows. It only wants to know about one at a time. And that abstraction is container.dataItem. Container.dataItem is one row of data from the data source bound to my parent. That's what it means. It's just a convention. And then open parent quote, the field name I want to bind to. So I've done this for title, title ID type, and pub ID. Let's view it. And there it is. So title, title ID, so forth. So this is not wildly compelling, this particular example, because I haven't done anything but format it like a tabular list. It could be a data grid, right? Not doing anything really special. Let's go a little deeper. And to do that, I'm going to go back to iBuySpy. So I said this is a data list here. So is this one. Let's go back. Oh, wrong thing. And so is this. So if we do a view source on this particular page, the products page, boost this up. We're doing something very similar to what you guys just saw with a simple example. I'm actually making a call against a middle tier object to get my data view. That's what this default view thing is. But I'm assigning it to data source on my list, and I'm data binding it. Whoops. It's the same thing. This source happens to be C#, so it looks a little different. And here's the declaration of my data list right here. I have an item template. Inside of it, I happen to have a table to help me format the precise spacing of my items inside. But I bound here to product ID, product image, model name, etc. And in this case, I'm binding into just some static HTML, actually. It's happening at bind time before I've rendered. None of these things are run at servered because I'm not posting back to the same page. And the result is this list right here. Let's look at one more example. Just to be sure that you're getting it. Can I get to, how do I get to the product? Oh, I think I need to go this way. Pagelets, nope, sorry. This version, I can't get to the documentation for this guy. Okay, I'm not going to go there. I have a different way to get to the source, but it's going to be too much out of the way. So let's go back to slides. So templates, the data binding syntax, angle bracket %, any valid code expression, including some of the ones we just saw. The code, a couple things to know. The code's evaluated in the language of the page. It's only evaluated when data bind is called, the method. And you can reference any other member of the page as we saw earlier. Here's the information about container. Container is kind of interesting. It's like your parent container control. In addition to data item, you can also get item index out of it, which is sometimes quite useful. And that is our template data binding example. So, in summary, it's a pretty powerful platform, ASP Plus is, for building these kinds of web UI. There are a lot of new things about how this works, but it's incredible how much code, how much it reduces the number of lines of code you have in your app. So this iBuySpy app has 13 pages and 6 pagelets, 6 middle tier objects, and a couple of web service and a couple of miscellaneous files, like a configuration file and a style sheet. And for the code, not including HTML declarative stuff, but just the stuff that's in code blocks, it's like 300 lines of code for the entire app. It's very, very lean. It's amazing how little code you really need when you're able to use the abstractions. The number of places we use angle bracket % equal, maybe 1 or 2 in the whole app. It's very much control-based and a really good example of how you can use this paradigm to build very powerful apps. The validation controls are also used in iBuySpy, and I'd urge you to have a look and see how that works for the login page and the register page. Very easy and very little code to make it work. At this point, I want to show you a couple of, I'm going to leave that slide up so you know the related sessions that I think are worthwhile, and then I'm going to throw the floor open to questions. Maybe the lights will come up. Well, I thought I saw somebody walking to the mic. No questions. You got it all, huh?
The equal sign, is that deprecated? Should we be moving away from that?
So that's a great question. It's not deprecated. We still support it, but it happens at render time. It doesn't happen at execution time with the rest of your page, only after all the rest of the execution has happened and it's time to render.
Okay.
So it's not really participating in the logic of the whole page in the same way.
Okay.
It's late bound. All of data binding is late bound if you do it in render blocks and so forth. So it's a choice you should think about before you make it. There are points at which it's useful to make. So one of the guys who's doing the controls section, the controls talk, was up here before this. Somebody asked a similar question and said, yeah, there are times when I use it. For example, if I'm rendering long lists of things out to the browser, I might at render time want to render some and then flush and then do a response flush and then render some more and do a response flush. Okay. So there's still reasons to use it, especially if you're doing response write loops in the render portion of your page. Okay. But for controlling the flow of logic in your page, I'd recommend you take a hard look at doing it the new way.
Okay. Okay. You, also, cursor types and lock types. You hadn't mentioned anything on that.
I'm the wrong person to ask about data binding.
Okay.
So I think on my list of talks, I have, maybe I don't have a data binding talk. I don't. There is a data binding talk on ADO Plus. I think it's called XML, and it's something really cryptically named, like, what is it? XML and ADO in Visual Studios.net or something like that.
Yeah, we just
it's a little cryptically named, but I'm the wrong person to give you much detail on that, I'm afraid. Yeah?
Yeah, on the templates, you were using a header, an item, and a footer. Are those
right.
defined by the data list server control?
So that's a great question. So the question was, where did those header item, item template, header template, footer template come from? Those are properties of the control. And a control can expose any number of templates, and they can be called anything.
Okay, but, so that'll be in the documentation for that control.
Yeah, so before you guys go, let me show you one more thing.
Okay.
I showed it last time, which was the class browser app. Back in Quick Start, there's an example app called Class Browser. Can we switch over to the code screen, please? Guys? Here it is. So I've gone down to the end of the list here. The last thing is called Class Browser. And it brings up this page, and I can just run the sample from here. If I had a link, I could run it right from the link. But I can drill into this and find the data grid, for example. Excuse me. And I'm going to be proved a liar. This is amazing. The item template should be listed here, and it's not. Okay, I'm a liar. So let me send you a different place. There's a list of templates in the Quick Start documentation. If you go to Web Controls or Web Forms Controls reference, go to any of the lists, data list, data grid, etc. And for each of these, we have a total list of all the templates that control supports. The names of the for custom controls, the names of the templates and the number of templates is totally up to the control developer, though. Next.
In your data list and data grid, is there any way to provide business rules on line items?
Business rules on line items. So
because I noticed, you're not doing a move next or anything. You just populate drop downs or have templates that just show the data.
So is your question, can I put something else in besides just
is there like an event that pops up as it moves to the next item to where you can like apply a business rule or do some other things?
So you're thinking about actually handling a move next on the records on the row set.
Right.
And that's not something that maps to the ADO Plus world. We get a static snapshot of the data, and then we bind to it. However, you can use a template and put drop-downs and checkboxes and so forth. In fact, on the iBuySpy app, in the checkout page, just add some, or the shopping cart page, we have a text box here and a checkbox there and so forth. It's totally possible to put different kinds of controls inside of grid or data list or so forth.
Okay.
And you can even populate lists inside of those.
Okay. One other question. Do you know if Commerce 2000 will be using ASP Plus?
I do not know. I'd be really surprised if they weren't.
It'd be nice.
Yeah.
Can you data bind to an XML stream and then use standard XSL template management for the select statement, things like that?
So the controls that we handed you on the bits today do not bind quite directly to XML. There's a method of data set that I happen to use here that will create a data set based on XML that you pass it, and you can bind to it. However, I think that the demo on Friday morning, the IE guys are actually going to show a series of web controls that use XML and XSL together to render content to the client. So it's definitely possible. There's nothing in the framework that prevents it. This set of controls doesn't do it exactly that way.
In ASP Plus, what happens to the old ASP object model that we were using? Does it go away, or is it deprecated?
So are you talking about objects like the response object and the request object and stuff? Yeah, that stuff is there. It's extended somewhat. There's a talk on this list called ASP Plus Tips and Tricks, and also a migrating talk. Both of those talk in quite a bit of detail about the things that are different and also extensions. But for the most part, it's all extensions. I'm not aware of any deprecations at all, or any removals. There are a couple of things that might be a little deprecated.
Is it still is that the preferred way to program an ASP Plus, is to continue to use that object model?
I would say in the case of control-based programming, you often don't need to go there. You'll still need to go there to get things off the query string, for example. We don't have any abstraction for that in the controls themselves. But when you were walking across the forms collection, or the forms collection that came back on the request object, you don't have to do that for the most part anymore. A lot of the framework pieces will do most of what you did with that before automatically. They'll take those values and put them into the controls, and then you just say mycontrol.txt and go from there instead of going into the controls collection. So the answer is yes and no. Some of it you'll continue to use just as you use it today. Some of it you'll likely end up just using the control encapsulation and leave the old way behind.
Thanks.
Hi, I have two questions. Could you go back to the page that shows the items available?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. How did they do a 2-up list there with the repeater?
Say again? Oh, the 2-up.
Well, they just changed it back.
Can you return to the iBuySpy, please? Thank you.
Did it change again?
Yes.
Oh, hey, can we switch back to the demo machine, please? Thank you, guys. So you want to know, how did I do this 2 list?
Yes.
Data list has this idea of helping you format items relative to one another, like left to right, top to bottom, how many columns across, etc. And this is just one property on the data list. I'll show it to you here.
So you told it you wanted 2 columns.
I told it I wanted 2 columns. In fact, in my first demo this morning, I actually built this list, this data list. And we built it with this internal columns, and then we went and added this, and it magically went from 1 column to 2 columns.
Cool.
That's all you have to do. There's another one called repeat direction that says I want you to render left to right before you repeat. You still get the same number of columns because we know that's the dimension people want to control on a web page.
So you can render down and then down the other side?
Yeah.
Or you can render across?
Yeah, either way.
Second question, can you go to your data grid, the first one where you use page.databind?
Okay, so we're going back to the simple ones. This one here,
Yes. The source code?
the source code.
On your page load, yeah, there. Source as object. Is the source the same as, let's see, this isn't it. There was another one where you did page.data.
So I managed to skim totally over the source and event args.
Actually, what I'm wondering is in one of them you said page.databind as opposed to an object, a particular control.
That was one of these very early ones, like maybe this one.
Yeah, like that exact one. Could you have there said sender.databind? Is that the same object?
So it's not wildly convenient, but for the page load method, the sender is the page itself. Yeah.
Can it run on FAT32?
I'm sorry, can you say again?
Can you run iBuySpy on FAT32?
Yes.
And what condition would it run on IIS 5 or also personal web server?
Only IS5 and only on Windows 2000 currently, because that's a requirement of the .NET frameworks for the bits that you have today.
What will I need to do if I wanted just to copy it from iBuySpy.com to a local host?
So to run the iBuySpy bits, you're going to need to have Windows 2000 Professional or Server, install IIS5 that comes with it, and install the .NET Frameworks bits that came in your set of 6 CDs today. You don't need Visual Studio. However, we have on the iBuySpy site versions that work in Visual Studio as well, using the Visual Studio paradigms for separating the logic from the HTML. And that's it.
I missed one thing that you said before. The frame, what dot frame I need or something like that?
The .NET frameworks.
And where do I get that from?
They're on the CDs that you got today after Bill G's keynote.
And there are so many CDs there.
I think it's CD 4.
I see.
I think it's the System File Update CD.
Thank you.
Yeah. I missed one thing.
Do I need front page extensions?
Only if you're going to use Visual Studio. If you're doing it as I've been doing it, just editing directly against the web server, you don't need to have the front page extensions. They're being used by Visual Studio to manage the app in IIS. I missed something. You do need SQL Server as well. 7.0 or 2000.
Installed.
Installed to run iBuySpy, yeah. You can also run iBuySpy right off the website and browse its sources from there if you don't feel like spending the time to set it up on your own machine.
Thank you.
View state, I missed how that was implemented. Does that require a session?
No, view state is put into that same hidden field. So we manage both view state and post back from that hidden field.
Okay, hidden posts.
It's a input type equal hidden. Value equals some big long encrypted string. Or short encrypted string. It depends on how much view state and post back you have on the form.
Thanks.
You talked about a lot about the rendering, sort of writing back to the browser. What about writing back from the browser to the database?
So
Has that changed?
it hasn't really changed. We're still looking, trying to find ways to solve that problem. The question was, how do I drive functionality from the browser to work on the server? And other than the post-back mechanism, that's all we're shipping in this time frame. But we're looking at ways before we RTM to have more rich ways to interact between the server and the browser without a post-back. But right now, there's nothing that we can show you.
Yes, this question refers to your validation controls. You had, where you specified it was an up level or a down level or automatic.
Yeah.
Whenever it's an up level browser, you said browser, so that means it could be IE. You said IE4 or greater. If it's a Netscape browser, it might upgrade browser. Is that coming down as HTML? Is that coming down as a script to do that validation? How is it doing that? Is that XML or what is that?
So yeah, let me describe in a little more detail. Currently, if you hit it with Netscape, we're not very smart about it. We just don't do up-level validation on Netscape.
Okay.
That same page won't do any. But for IE, we send down not only HTML, we also send down script. I can run the page and do a view source on it if you want to see how it's
Is it VB script? Is that what you're downloading?
It's JScript. It's JavaScript.
Oh, so you're formatting the JavaScript and sending it down as a validation control. Because we do that. I do that manually now. You're saying
we do it
that's automatically done via the control. Correct.
Right. So it's an include file. There's a little bit of JavaScript that we squirt into the page itself in a script block that enumerates a collection in JavaScript on the client of all the validation controls that it's working with. And then we include another JavaScript file. So if a client's done it a few times, they possibly will have some of it cached on the client.
So you could take that control. Let's say it validated a certain way, and you could want to build your own control. You could take that control and include that control and add on to it and make it a download.
Yeah, you could derive from that control.
Okay.
So go to the controls talks to find out how that works, though.
Okay.
Any other questions? I'll be up here if anybody else wants to stop by. Otherwise, thanks.